Yeah, pat, 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 is Trump's way of telling Putin that he's the man who's in charge. I'm Peter Collett. I'm an expert on body language, and this is my take on the exchanges between Putin and Trump. Right from the start, we can see there's a big body language difference between Putin and Trump. Putin, for example, almost sprints down. He's trying to display to the world that he's energetic, he's got an agenda, he's there to do something important. Trump, on the other hand, emerges from Air Force One, and you can see him staring at the steps. He's very worried. He reaches for the banister, the rail, and goes down one step at a time. Now, this is partly an indication of his age and the fact that he might have had a fall or two in the past. But there's also potentially a kind of psychological angle on this one. Unconsciously, he's not so worried about falling physically, but falling politically. In the initial handshake between Putin and Trump, there's some extremely interesting information. Putin extending his arm way in advance, showing his enthusiasm, his commitment to the handshake. Trump extends his hand with the palm facing up. That allows the other person, in this case Putin, to get his hand on top. In other words, to be more dominant. But one of the reasons that Trump makes a habit of doing this is that it allows him to flex his bicep and to pull the other person towards him. What's fascinating about the second handshake is that after the pat, and the pat, by the way, is Trump's way of telling Putin that he's the man who's in charge. It's what's called a status reminder. Even after the pat, you'll notice another little shake, a kind of way of reassuring Putin that he's committed to the handshake and that he's very pleased to meet him. One of the things that men often do to women is get their hand behind their back and allow them, for example, to go through the door first. Now, this looks like an expression of politeness, but in fact, it's a dominance display because it's the person who's in power, the person who's the superior, the person who's calling the shots, who, as it were, guides the other individual and gets a chance to put their hand on their back, on the other person's back, as they guide them through the space. And that's exactly what we see here. What's interesting about this exchange between Putin and Trump is the high degree of smiling. It's a very serious, somber occasion, and they've come there to negotiate with some intensity, and yet they find time and the opportunity to smile. And these are genuine smiles, by the way. They're not displayed smiles. For example, we do see a kind of fake smile during the news conference from Trump. It's what I call a flashbulb smile, where there's no smile, it emerges and then disappears very quickly again. But all these other smiles that we see in the early phase of their encounter, both by Trump and Putin, are genuine smiles because they evolve naturally, enlist those special little muscles around the eye, which are an indication of genuine pleasure. There's some real giveaways at the bilateral meeting. Look at the way in which they position their legs, specifically the angle between their thighs. Now, this is what's called man spreading. And what we find is that highly dominant men tend to spread their thighs wide apart. And when we compare Trump and Putin, we find, hey, there's Putin with a much wider spread, in other words, a much greater dominance display. Putin sitting upright, ramrod, looking very confident, whereas poor old Trump is all crumpled and turned inwards. He's obviously got a lot on his mind that's bothering him. But the two other little gestures, the mouth purse. It's a form of self-restraint. It's a way of stopping themselves from saying something which has gone through their mind and they suddenly realize, I shouldn't say that. There's another gesture, which we see on numerous occasions, but most importantly, right at the end, when Trump says thank you to everybody for coming along. And that's this gesture. This is what I call the oxbow mouth. In the process, tense their chin, almost as though they believe, consciously or otherwise, that somebody else is going to punch them on the chin. So when you see politicians, or for that matter, anybody, doing this mouth posture, it's quite often because they're feeling vulnerable and unconsciously feel the need to protect themselves. That's my feeling about what actually happened during the conference. Poor Trump, full of promise, full of expectation, but he was hoping that he would be able to take away another one of his great successes, and came away with nothing. That's why he wasn't feeling happy with himself or with the situation he found himself in, and we find that revealed in his little mouth postures.